My mother toasted my sister as her only proud accomplishment at Thanksgiving dinner, while I didn't even have a chair. So, I walked out and initiated the corporate restructuring plan that legally seized every asset they falsely claimed to own. Before we continue today's story, we have an urgent announcement to make. Due to technical issues, we are pivoting towards another channel. Please subscribe to our new channel, Kin and Karma. You can find the link in the video description, the pinned comment, and the collaboration tag on this video. Make sure to switch over now so you don't miss out. Thank you for your support. Now back to the story. The migraine had been blinding me for 3 straight days, a relentless, throbbing drumbeat behind my right eye that made even the softest sliver of daylight feel like a physical assault. I was 36 years old, a corporate restructuring specialist who spent my life salvaging dying companies, but my own body was currently in a state of total liquidation. The stress of the last quarter had finally broken my immune system, leaving me shivering under a mountain of blankets in my apartment, clutching a half-empty mug of ginger tea that had gone ice-cold hours ago. My doctor had called it severe adrenal fatigue and prescribed absolute rest, warning me that if I didn't stop working 80-hour weeks, my heart would simply give out. But rest is a luxury you cannot afford when you are the invisible financial pillar, holding up an entire family's crumbling facade. I reached for my phone, squinting against the harsh glare of the screen. I only intended to check the time, to see if I had slept through the afternoon, and if I needed to drag myself out of bed to prepare for the obligatory Thanksgiving dinner at my parents' house later that evening. Instead, a notification banner caught my eye. It was an email from my father, Mason. Or rather, it was an email forwarded by Mason, clearly by accident, with the intended recipient being my mother, Margaret. The subject line was innocuously titled, FWD, Updated Trust and Corporate Transfer Docs, Gabriella. My thumb hovered over the screen. A cold, sinking sensation began to spread in the pit of my stomach, momentarily overriding the pounding in my head. I tapped the email to open it. The message thread below my father's accidental forward was a long chain between him, my mother, and a sleazy boutique lawyer I had specifically advised them never to use. As I scrolled through the text, my breath hitched in my throat, catching sharply as the reality of the words began to sink in. Margaret, the lawyer, confirmed that as long as Riley continues to service the primary corporate debt under her personal LLC, we can transfer the title of the lake house and the remaining liquid equity from the family firm directly into Gabriella's newly formed brand consultancy, Mason had written. We will announce the transfer to Gabriella at Thanksgiving dinner. It will be her official inheritance early. We just need to keep Riley distracted and make sure she doesn't review the Q4 ledger until the ink is dry. Below that was my mother's reply. Thank God, Gabriella deserves a fresh start without being weighed down by all that ugly corporate debt. Riley is built for the stress. She's practically a machine anyway. She won't even notice until next year, and by then, Gabriella will be established. It's the only way to ensure at least one of our daughters has a life to be proud of. I read the words again, and then a third time. Riley is practically a machine anyway. All that ugly corporate debt. I had spent the last 7 years slowly, painstakingly bailing my parents out of a massive, multi-million-dollar insolvency crisis that my father had caused through sheer incompetence. I had leveraged my own professional reputation, taken out loans in my name, and restructured their failing company into a holding entity just to keep a roof over their heads. I had sacrificed my 20s, my relationships, and now my health entirely for them. And here they were, actively conspiring to strip the only remaining assets of value out of the company, gift them to my younger sister Gabriella, and leave me holding a bag of toxic, crushing debt that would financially ruin me forever. The room spun. A wave of profound, suffocating nausea washed over me, so intense I had to grip the edge of the mattress to keep from falling onto the floor. This wasn't just a slight. This was a calculated, devastating financial assassination orchestrated by the people who had given me life. The betrayal was worse than the diagnosis itself. For almost an hour, I simply sat in the silent gloom of my bedroom, the blue light of my phone screen long extinguished. The physical pain in my body was entirely eclipsed by a cold, hollow numbness that seemed to echo in my chest. My mind, usually a rapid-fire processor of spreadsheets, risk assessments, and strategic forecasts, was completely blank. I felt like a building that had just undergone a controlled demolition, waiting for the dust to settle before the wreckage could be surveyed. The silence was shattered by the harsh, vibrating buzz of my phone against the wooden nightstand. I flinched, my eyes darting to the caller ID. Mom. I let it ring 3 times, taking a slow, shaky breath to steady my racing heart. I pressed the phone to my ear. Hello. Riley, honestly, are you still sleeping? Margaret's voice was sharp, a familiar tone of perpetually irritated disappointment that I had heard my entire life. There was no hello, no inquiry about my severe illness, just immediate, grating impatience. Dinner is at 6. The caterers are already setting up, and Gabriella is bringing 3 of her new clients. I expect you to be here, and please, try to look presentable this time. Don't wear one of those drab gray corporate pantsuits. It's Thanksgiving, not a board meeting. I closed my eyes, visualizing the email thread still sitting in my inbox. She's practically a machine anyway. I'm still very sick, Mom, I said, my voice hoarse, devoid of its usual accommodating warmth. My fever spiked again last night. Oh, for heaven's sake, Margaret sighed heavily into the receiver, the sound dripping with theatrical exhaustion. You always do this, Riley. You always find a way to make everything so difficult right when we need things to be perfect for Gabriella. She has had a very stressful month launching her new brand, and she needs family support today. Take a pill, drink some coffee, and get over here. And don't bring up work tonight. Nobody wants to hear about your depressing spreadsheets while we are trying to celebrate. She didn't wait for my response. The line went dead with a sharp click. I pulled the phone away from my ear and stared at the dark screen. The sheer audacity of her demands, the casual cruelty woven into every syllable, was staggering. She wanted me there not as a daughter, but as a prop. A quiet, drab background character to sit silently while they celebrated the sister who was actively being handed the fruits of my decade of grueling labor. They wanted me to smile and pass the cranberry sauce while they finalized my financial execution. I slowly pushed the heavy duvet off my legs and swung my feet over the edge of the bed. The room tilted dangerously, and a wave of dizziness forced me to grip the nightstand, my knuckles turning white. I forced myself to stand. The weakness in my legs was profound, a physical manifestation of the exhaustion that had plagued me for years. But as I stood there in the quiet of my apartment, the numbness began to recede, replaced by a slow, burning ember of crystalline focus. They thought I was just a machine, a mindless drone who would blindly process their debts and absorb their abuse without question. They thought they could outmaneuver a senior restructuring specialist in a game of corporate asset transfer. I walked over to my desk, my reflection in the dark monitor showing pale skin and dark, bruised circles under my eyes. I looked terrible. I looked exactly like a woman on the verge of total collapse. Good. Let them think I was weak. Let them think their plan was moving forward flawlessly. I reached down and powered on my computer, the screen flaring to life and casting a harsh, unforgiving light across my face. They thought they had secured their future and destroyed mine with a few signatures from a cheap lawyer. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. To understand the sheer magnitude of the delusion my family operated under, you have to understand the history of the family business. Decades ago, my father, Mason, had inherited a highly lucrative regional logistics firm. But Mason was not a businessman. He was a man who liked the idea of being a businessman. He liked country club memberships, expensive leasing agreements on imported cars, and taking clients to exorbitant dinners. He had slowly bled the company dry over 20 years. By the time I was 27 and working my way up at a top-tier corporate restructuring firm in the city, the family business was weeks away from Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The bank was preparing to foreclose on my parents' sprawling, heavily mortgaged estate. Mason had come to my small apartment in tears, a broken, terrified man, begging me to save him. "Just fix it, Riley," he had pleaded, his hands shaking. "Protect your mother. Don't let her know how bad it is. It would break her heart." So I fixed it. I took a leave of absence, moved back into my childhood bedroom, and ruthlessly gutted the failing company. I negotiated with aggressive creditors, laid off dead weight, and personally assumed a terrifying amount of liability to secure bridge loans. I created a complex corporate structure, a holding company, to shield their remaining assets from immediate seizure. I worked 100-hour weeks, sleeping on the floor of the office, fueled by black coffee and sheer desperation, to save my family from the streets. And while I was drowning in legal filings and debt restructuring, my younger sister, Gabriella, was finding herself. Gabriella is exactly 30 years old and has never held a job for longer than 6 months. She is stunningly beautiful, armed with a perfectly curated online aesthetic and a vocabulary consisting entirely of empty corporate buzzwords she doesn't actually understand. While I was fighting off aggressive debt collectors, she was studying abroad in Florence, entirely funded by credit cards Mason had secretly taken out against the company's dwindling lines of credit. Whenever I tried to confront my parents about her reckless spending, Margaret would fiercely intervene, her eyes blazing with protective fury. "Gabriella is creative, Riley," Margaret would snap, waving away my spreadsheets. "She has a vision. She isn't meant to be trapped in a dreary office like you. She needs capital to build her personal brand. You just don't understand because you don't have an artistic bone in your body." Gabriella's personal brand currently consisted of calling herself a lifestyle and brand consultant. She essentially demanded money from my parents to buy designer clothes, go to exclusive resorts, and take photos of herself, claiming it was all networking and brand building. She had no actual clients, no revenue streams, and no discernible skills other than manipulating my mother into believing she was on the verge of international superstardom. And now, according to the email, they were transferring the last solvent assets, the lake house and the remaining liquid capital I had fought so hard to secure, directly into Gabriella's fictional consultancy, to protect it from the massive debt they had accrued and that I was currently managing. They were going to leave me holding a multi-million-dollar grenade, and they were going to pull the pin at Thanksgiving dinner. I remembered the last family gathering we had. It was Margaret's birthday, a lavish affair paid for by a bonus Mason claimed he received, which I knew for a fact was a high-interest payday loan he had taken out in the company's name without my authorization. Gabriella had arrived 2 hours late, sweeping into the restaurant wearing a silk designer dress that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She hadn't apologized for her tardiness. Instead, she immediately commanded the attention of the entire table, launching into a convoluted story about a synergy meeting she supposedly had with a major cosmetics brand. "It's all about disruptive market positioning, honestly," Gabriella had said, swirling her expensive champagne. She had looked across the table at me, her gaze dripping with condescension. "You wouldn't really get it, Riley. It's not like crunching numbers. It requires intuition, an eye for aesthetic value. Speaking of which, are you still wearing that same blazer? I swear I saw you in that at Christmas 2 years ago." Margaret had laughed, reaching over to pat Gabriella's hand. "Your sister is very practical, darling. We can't all have your refined tastes." Mason had just looked down at his plate, avoiding my eyes entirely. That was the dynamic. I was the unappreciated plow horse, expected to pull the cart until I collapsed, while Gabriella was the prized show pony, showered with ribbons for simply existing. I stared at the holding company's master charter on my screen. 7 years ago, when Mason was begging me to save him, he had signed everything I put in front of him without reading a single page. He had been too panicked, too desperate to avoid the public humiliation of bankruptcy. He assumed that because I was his daughter, the complex corporate structures I built were designed exclusively to serve him. He assumed wrong. When I built the LLC that absorbed their toxic debt, I also built the holding company that owned the titles to the lake house and the remaining equity. And hidden deep within the dense, 90-page operating agreement, written in impenetrable legalese that neither Mason nor his cheap boutique lawyer could ever hope to decipher, was a single, devastating clause regarding voting shares and executive control. I didn't just manage the holding company, I owned it. I hit print on the master charter, the machine whirring to life beside me. Tonight, I was going to let them have their little celebration. I was going to let them toast to the golden child. And then, I was going to show them exactly what a corporate restructuring specialist does to a hostile, failing entity. The moment the printer finished churning out the 90-page master charter, my exhaustion evaporated, replaced by a cold, hyper-focused adrenaline. I was no longer a sick, tired daughter. I was a senior financial analyst examining a hostile entity attempting a hostile takeover of my assets. I sat back down at my desk, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I log D into the secure, encrypted banking portals I had set up years ago to manage the family's labyrinth of debt. Mason, in his infinite financial ignorance, had assumed that because his name was on the outgoing checks, he still retained executive authority over the holding company. He didn't understand that I had structured the entire enterprise under a blind trust, of which I was the sole irrevocable trustee. I had done it initially to protect the assets from his creditors, but now it was protecting the assets from him. I needed to see exactly how far this delusion had gone. I navigated to the outgoing wire transfer logs for the past 3 quarters. My eyes scanned the digital ledger, and my jaw tightened. There it was, dozens of highly irregular disbursements, all rooted to a recently registered limited liability company, Gabriella Visionary Consulting, LLC. I clicked into the detailed transaction histories, forcing myself to read every single line item. The sheer audacity of what I was looking at made my stomach churn. These weren't modest withdrawals for legitimate startup costs like website hosting or legal incorporation fees. These were massive, bleeding hemorrhages of capital, masked behind laughably vague corporate jargon. There was a $12,000 wire transfer categorized as immersive market research retreat. I cross-referenced the date with Gabriella's public social media accounts. The date aligned perfectly with a 2-week luxury vacation she had taken to a 5-star resort in Tulum, Mexico. I found another invoice for $8,000 labeled client-facing aesthetic procurement. That one matched a photo she had posted holding a limited edition designer handbag, complete with the caption, "Investing in the brand." For over a year, my father had been quietly siphoning the very funds I was meticulously managing to keep the bank from foreclosing on his home, funneling them directly into Gabriella's lavish, fabricated lifestyle. He was stealing from the life raft to buy his favorite daughter first-class tickets on a sinking ship. But it wasn't just the petty theft of the cash reserves that solidified my strategy. I dug deeper, pulling the state registry files for Gabriella Visionary Consulting, LLC. I needed to know what this so-called business actually consisted of. It took me less than 20 minutes to uncover the hollow core of her entire operation. The company had 0 registered clients. It had generated 0 taxable income. The only money moving into the LLC was the money Mason was illegally transferring out of the holding company. I printed every single wire transfer, every fraudulent invoice, and every damning state registry document. I collated them into a neat, thick manila folder. The paper felt heavy in my hands, a physical manifestation of a decade of my stolen labor and their profound deception. I walked into my bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. My reflection was still pale, but my eyes were sharp, devoid of the weary resignation that had clouded them for years. They wanted me to be the quiet, dependable machine. They wanted me to sit at their table and smile while they celebrated my ruin. I picked up the manila folder, slid it into my leather briefcase, and grabbed my car keys. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. I was going to show up to Thanksgiving dinner. The driveway of my parents' sprawling estate was packed with expensive cars when I arrived. I parked my modest sedan at the very end of the line, taking a deep, steadying breath before stepping out into the crisp November air. The heavy oak front door swung open before I even reached the porch. Margaret stood in the entryway, holding a crystal wine glass, her eyes immediately scanning me from head to toe with practiced, sharp disapproval. "Well, you finally decided to grace us with your presence," she said, her voice carrying down the hall. She frowned at my attire, a tailored navy blazer, dark trousers, and a simple cream blouse. "I explicitly asked you not to wear your office clothes, Riley. You look like you're about to audit the turkey, and you look terribly pale. Did you even bother with blush?" "Hello, Mother. Happy Thanksgiving," I replied evenly, stepping past her. I didn't offer an excuse for my health, nor did I apologize for my clothes. I simply kept walking toward the living room, where the sounds of loud, artificial laughter echoed. The living room was warm, smelling of roasted garlic, expensive candles, and sheer entitlement. Gabriella was perched on the edge of the velvet sofa, holding court. She wore a stunning emerald green silk dress, her hair perfectly styled. Surrounding her were three people I had never seen before, two women and a man, all dressed in equally flashy, overly trendy clothing. And so I told the branding executive, "If you don't understand the synergistic flow of the demographic, you're just throwing capital into a void," Gabriella was saying, waving her manicured hand in the air. The three strangers nodded vigorously, murmuring their absolute agreement. Mason was standing near the fireplace, beaming with pride as he watched his youngest daughter. He caught my eye as I entered, and for a fraction of a second, his smile faltered, a flash of nervous guilt crossing his face before he quickly masked it. "Riley, you made it," Mason called out, his voice slightly too loud, slightly too hearty. Gabriella turned, her smile tightening as she looked me up and down. "Riley, I wasn't sure you'd make it out of your cubicle today. Everyone, this is my older sister, Riley. She does math for a living." The three strangers offered polite, slightly pitying smiles. "Actually, I'm a corporate restructuring specialist," I said, my voice calm, projecting effortlessly across the room. I walked over and extended my hand to the man sitting closest to Gabriella. "Riley, nice to meet you. You must be one of Gabriella's new clients." The man shook my hand, looking momentarily confused. "Oh, no, I'm Derek. I'm a DJ. Gabriella and I are collaborating on a lifestyle soundscape project." "A soundscape project," I repeated, letting the words hang in the air just a second too long. "Fascinating. And how is the return on investment looking for that initiative? Have you established a clear monetization pathway, or is this primarily a top-of-funnel brand awareness exercise?" Derek blinked, completely lost. We're just vibing it out right now, honestly." I turned to Gabriella, offering a bright, razor-sharp smile. "Vibing it out? How innovative. I was actually looking at your corporate filings this afternoon, Gabriella. Gabriella Visionary Consulting LLC, correct? I noticed something incredibly interesting about your revenue streams." The room went dead silent. The clinking of glasses stopped. Gabriella's perfect posture stiffened, her eyes narrowing. "Why are you looking at my business filings, Riley? That is completely inappropriate." "Just professional curiosity," I said smoothly, taking a step closer. "You see, in my line of work, we look for discrepancies. And the most fascinating discrepancy with your consultancy is that, according to the state tax registry, you haven't generated a single dollar of external revenue since your incorporation. In fact, your sole source of incoming capital appears to be direct, unclassified wire transfers from a holding company." Gabriella's face flushed a deep, furious red. She stood up abruptly. "You have no idea what you're talking about. My business is in the aggressive growth phase. I am building equity. You're just jealous because you sit in a gray box all day while I'm actually creating something beautiful." She was lashing out loudly, her threats empty, her lies obvious to anyone who knew how to listen. "You don't understand modern business," she yelled, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You just want to ruin my day because you have nothing of your own to celebrate." "I understand modern business perfectly," Gabriella, I replied, my voice dropping to a quiet, dangerous register. I understand it well enough to know the difference between a visionary entrepreneur and a fraudulent parasite. Riley, that is enough. Margaret's voice cracked like a whip across the room. She marched over, her face a mask of absolute fury, placing a protective hand on Gabriella's arm. How dare you speak to your sister that way? In our home, in front of her guests, you will apologize immediately. Before I could respond, Mason was suddenly beside me, his hand clamping down hard on my elbow. His grip was entirely too tight, trembling with a poorly concealed panic. Riley, a word. Now, he hissed through gritted teeth. He didn't wait for my consent. He practically dragged me out of the living room, down the long hallway, and shoved me into his private study, slamming the heavy oak door shut behind us. The study smelled of aged leather and the expensive Scotch Mason could no longer afford. He turned to face me, his chest heaving, his face pale and sweating. The facade of the confident patriarch had completely shattered. Are you out of your mind? Mason demanded, his voice a frantic whisper. What are you doing? Why are you digging into Gabriella's accounts? I told you to stay out of her business. She needs that startup capital, Riley. You promised to protect this family. I promised to protect you from bankruptcy, Dad, I said, calmly smoothing out the sleeve of my blazer where he had grabbed me. I set my leather briefcase on his mahogany desk and popped the brass latches. I did not promise to fund a fictional lifestyle for your golden child, and I certainly didn't promise to let you transfer my legal assets to her. Mason froze, his eyes widening in sheer terror. What? What are you talking about? I received your email this afternoon, the one you accidentally forwarded to me instead of Mom. I said, pulling the thick manila folder from my briefcase and dropping it onto the desk with a heavy thud. The email detailing your brilliant plan to transfer the lake house and the remaining liquid equity to Gabriella. Mason opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish gasping for air. Riley, you don't understand. Your mother insisted. Gabriella needs security. You're strong, you always figure things out. But the company doesn't exist anymore, Dad, I interrupted, my voice devoid of any warmth. You bankrupted the company 7 years ago. What exists now is a holding LLC. An LLC that I built. An LLC that I personally guaranteed. And an LLC that, according to the master charter you signed without reading, I hold 100% of the executive voting shares for. Mason stared at me, uncomprehending. No, that's my company. I am the president. You are a figurehead, I corrected him coldly. I opened the folder and slid the first stack of papers toward him. And you are a figurehead who has been committing corporate fraud. Look at these. Mason looked down at the highlighted spreadsheets. His hands shook as he picked up the first page. These are the wire transfers you've been authorizing to Gabriella's fake consultancy, I explained, tapping the paper. Over $80,000 in the last 10 months alone, coded as business expenses. But I have the receipts, Dad. She spent it on luxury vacations, designer clothes, and paying off her personal credit cards. You drained the emergency tax reserve I set up for the holding company to buy her a wardrobe. She told me it was for marketing, Mason stammered, his eyes darting frantically across the numbers, desperately searching for a way out. She said she needed to project success to attract clients. It's an investment, Riley. She's going to pay it all back once the brand takes off. You have to fix this. You have to move the money around like you always do. If your mother finds out the tax reserve is gone. He was still defending her. Even staring at the absolute, irrefutable proof of her parasitism and his own ruin, his instinct was to protect Gabriella and beg me to absorb the damage. The depth of his manipulated loyalty was staggering. There is no moving the money around this time, I said, closing the folder with a sharp snap. Because as of 3 o'clock this afternoon, I have frozen every single outgoing account associated with the holding company. I have revoked your signatory access. You cannot transfer the lake house. You cannot transfer the equity. You cannot give Gabriella another dime. Mason stumbled backward, collapsing into his heavy leather desk chair. Riley, please, you can't do this. If we don't give Gabriella that house, your mother will leave me. She'll know I failed. She'll know everything is gone. She is going to know everything tonight, I said, zipping my briefcase closed. From down the hallway, the sharp, melodic chime of the dinner bell rang out, echoing through the large house. It was time. I looked down at my father, a broken, terrified man trapped in a prison of his own making. Wash your face, Dad. It's time to carve the turkey. The dining room was a masterclass in suffocating opulence. I walked down the long hallway from the study and stepped through the arched doorway just as everyone was taking their seats. The air was thick with the smell of roasted turkey, expensive sage dressing, and the distinct, cloying perfume Gabriella always wore. The massive mahogany table was draped in heavy, imported white linen, perfectly reflecting the warm glow of the crystal chandelier overhead. I stood at the threshold, my eyes scanning the intricately folded napkins and the personalized, gold-embossed place cards resting gently against the rims of the fine china. There was a card for Margaret at the head of the table, a card for Mason at the other end. Gabriella was seated like royalty in the direct center, flanked by her 3 guests, Derek the DJ, and the 2 young women whose names I hadn't bothered to learn. I looked for my place card, I looked for my chair. There were exactly 6 chairs positioned around the massive table. My chair wasn't even set at the table. I stood there in my tailored navy blazer, the heavy manila folder still gripped tightly in my right hand, silently processing the sheer, breathtaking disrespect of the visual in front of me. I had paid for the table. I had paid for the chairs. I had paid for the crystal champagne flutes they were currently filling with expensive vintage wine. And my mother hadn't even bothered to set a place for me in the house I was bankrupting myself to save. Margaret caught my eye from across the room. She didn't look apologetic. She looked supremely annoyed by my presence. Well, Riley, you were locked in the study with your father for so long, and you said you were deathly ill this morning. I assumed you. We're just going to leave and go back to bed. We couldn't hold up the entire meal waiting for you to make an appearance. Gabriella offered a sympathetic, entirely fake pout, reaching out to touch Derek's arm. It's okay, Mom. Riley is probably eager to get back to her spreadsheets anyway. She doesn't really vibe with this kind of celebratory, high-frequency energy. She needs her quiet time. Margaret smiled warmly at Gabriella, raising her crystal flute into the air, the light catching the rising bubbles. She reached over and tapped her silver spoon against the glass, the sharp, melodic ringing cutting through the ambient noise of the room and demanding absolute attention. "Everyone, please," Margaret announced, her voice adopting a theatrical, sweeping cadence. "Before we eat this wonderful meal, I want to make a very special announcement. Today is a day of giving thanks, but it is also a day of recognizing true, visionary success and embracing the future." She turned her gaze entirely away from me, focusing her absolute, undivided adoration on my younger sister. "Let's toast to the only child who actually made us proud," Margaret said, her voice dripping with profound emotional sincerity. "To Gabriella and her beautiful, flourishing new empire." The 3 guests immediately raised their glasses, murmuring their enthusiastic agreement. Everyone turned to my sister and clapped. Gabriella beamed, a picture of flawless, triumphant validation, raising her own glass to accept the applause of the sycophants she had gathered. I didn't yell, I didn't cry. The burning, exhausted anger that had propelled me through the last 7 years suddenly crystallized into a state of absolute, icy calm. I looked at my mother, who still deliberately refused to make eye contact with me, and then at my sister, basking in the stolen glory of a life I was actively financing. I stood up straighter, took a deep, steadying breath, and let the silence stretch out until the clapping awkwardly died down and the guests took a sip of their champagne. "Thanks for finally saying it out loud," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but the acoustic perfection of the dining room carried every single syllable with lethal clarity. The smiles instantly froze on the guests' faces. Margaret blinked, her mouth opening in shock at my sheer audacity to interrupt her perfect moment. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't wait for the inevitable lecture. I simply turned on my heel and walked back out into the hallway, heading straight toward the front door. "Oh, don't be so incredibly dramatic, Riley," Margaret called out from behind me, her voice tinged with sharp exasperation. "We're trying to have a nice dinner. Stop making everything about you." I kept walking. I reached the grand entryway, my hand extending toward the heavy brass handle of the front door. I was done. I was finally, truly done. I stopped cold when my dad started panicking. "Riley, no, wait, please stop." Mason's voice was a ragged, terrifying sound that tore through the quiet house. It wasn't his usual booming, confident patriarchal tone. It was the high-pitched, desperate shriek of a man watching his life support get abruptly unplugged. He came sprinting out of the study, his face flushed a dangerous, mottled purple, practically tackling me from behind to keep me from turning the doorknob. "You can't leave, you can't," he gasped, his fingers digging painfully into the fabric of my blazer. He turned frantically back toward the dining room archway, his eyes wide and wild with absolute terror. "Margaret, don't let her leave. The accounts, Margaret. She froze the accounts. She owns everything." The dining room fell into a dead, horrifying silence. Margaret slowly lowered her champagne glass, her perfectly sculpted brow furrowing in deep, angry confusion. "Mason, what on earth are you blabbering about? What accounts? Control yourself in front of the guests." Gabriella stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. Her face was pale. "Dad, stop it. You're embarrassing me in front of my network. Go back into the study." But Mason was utterly broken. The decades of lying, the crushing weight of the hidden debt, and the sudden, terrifying realization that I had actually cut the financial cord had finally shattered his carefully constructed reality. He looked at Gabriella, his golden child, and then back to his wife. The sheer panic in his eyes shifted, slowly transforming into a profound, devastating resignation. He let out a long, shuddering sob. "There is no network, Gabriella," Mason choked out, tears suddenly spilling over his lower eyelids and tracking down his flushed cheeks. He let go of my arm and took a slow, stumbling step toward the dining table, his hands trembling violently. "There is no empire. There is no money. There hasn't been any money for a very long time." "Mason, what are you saying?" Margaret demanded, her voice trembling slick. "TLY now?" She looked from my father to me, realizing for the very first time that the power dynamic in the room had fundamentally, irrevocably shifted. "Riley, what did you do to him?" "I didn't do anything, Mother," I replied, my voice steady and cold. I walked slowly back into the dining room, stepping past my weeping father. I walked directly over to the center of the table, right to where Gabriella was standing. I dropped the thick manila folder directly onto her personalized gold-embossed place setting with a heavy, final thud. I just stopped paying for the illusion. I flipped the folder open. The top document was the state registry printout showing her zero-revenue business. The next was the heavily highlighted ledger of unauthorized wire transfers. "Dad," Gabriella commanded, her voice shrill and tight with sudden, genuine terror. She didn't look at the papers. "Tell her to stop. Tell her to get out of my house." But Mason didn't defend her. For the first time in his entire life, he didn't step in to shield her from the consequences of her own actions. He walked slowly over to the table, his shoulders slumped in total defeat, and he looked Margaret dead in the eye. "We are bankrupt, Margaret," he said, the words falling from his mouth like heavy stones. "We have been completely bankrupt for 7 years. I lost the company. I lost everything. The only reason we still have this house, the only reason we have food on this table right now, is because Riley took over the debt. She assumed millions in liabilities. She built a holding company to save us from living on the street." Margaret stared at him, her mouth opening and closing silently. She looked around at the opulent room, at the crystal and the silver, as if the walls themselves were suddenly made of cheap, dissolving cardboard. "And Gabriella's company," Margaret whispered, her eyes darting to my sister, a look of profound horror dawning on her face. "The startup capital you gave her is a massive, illegal fraud," I stated firmly, pointing to the spreadsheets so the guests could clearly see the numbers. I looked directly at Derek and the two women, who were now shifting incredibly uncomfortably in their seats, realizing they had blindly walked into a catastrophic family financial execution. Every single dime Gabriella has spent in the last 10 months, the trips to Chalum, the designer clothes, the networking dinners, was stolen by my father from the emergency tax reserve I built to pay off his corporate creditors. She has 0 clients. She has 0 actual income. She is a parasite feeding off the rotting corpse of our family's finances. "That's a lie," Gabriella shrieked, slamming her hands down hard on the table, violently knocking over her crystal champagne flute. The expensive liquid spilled across the white linen, dripping steadily onto the hardwood floor. "I am building a brand. I am a recognized lifestyle influencer. You are just a jealous, bitter, ugly cubicle drone who wants to ruin my life because no one loves you." She looked to our father, her eyes wide with desperate expectation, demanding him to silence me like he always did. "Dad, do something. Tell them she's a liar. Tell them it's my money." Mason looked at Gabriella. He looked at the spilled champagne dripping onto the floor, at the highlighted wire transfers exposing his crimes, and then at me, his exhausted, physically ill, fiercely competent daughter who had sacrificed her youth to save his foolish pride. "No," Mason said. The word was quiet, but it carried the immense weight of a dying star. He stood up a little straighter, wiping the tears from his face, a sudden, desperate strength washing over him as he finally abandoned the lie he had lived for a decade. "No more, Gabriella. I'm done," Mason said, his voice gaining a newfound, tragic firmness. "I am done stealing from your sister to buy your affection. I am done pretending you are a success while she works herself into the hospital. I will not lie for you anymore." He turned to Margaret, closing his eyes in deep shame. "I'm sorry, Maggie. I'm so sorry. I was a coward. But Riley is the only reason we aren't sleeping in a shelter, and we treated her like absolute dirt." Margaret physically staggered backward, collapsing heavily into her chair at the head of the table. She stared at Gabriella, her golden child, seeing her clearly for the very first time. Not as a visionary entrepreneur, but as the incredibly expensive, cruel consequence of their own terrible, enabling parenting. Gabriella looked around the room, hyperventilating as she realized she had completely lost control of the narrative. She turned to Derek the DJ, plastering on a frantic, terrifyingly fake smile. "Derek, please, you know my vision. You know the synergy we discussed." "Look, man, I'm just gonna go," Derek muttered, standing up so fast his chair nearly tipped over. He grabbed his coat from the back of his seat, refusing to make eye contact with her. The other two women were already standing up, their faces pale with profound, agonizing second-hand embarrassment. "This is way too intense for me, honestly. Good luck with all of the legal stuff." They scrambled out of the dining room without another word, the heavy front door clicking shut behind them, leaving the four of us standing in the suffocating, ruinous silence of a destroyed Thanksgiving. The golden child's fake empire had fallen, and I hadn't even had to raise my voice. The aftermath of that Thanksgiving dinner was swift, legally brutal, and incredibly liberating. I didn't stay to eat the turkey. After my father finally confessed the truth and shattered Gabriella's facade, I simply picked up my empty folder, walked out the front door, drove back to my apartment, crawled into my own bed, and finally allowed my exhausted body to genuinely rest. My fever broke the next morning, and with it, the suffocating, decade-long fever dream of my family's toxic manipulation finally ended forever. On Monday morning, I arrived at my corporate restructuring firm not as a senior analyst managing a client's portfolio, but as a client desperately in need of my own firm's services. I sat down in the glass-walled conference room with my senior partners and our chief legal counsel, and I laid out the exact parameters of my father's extensive embezzlement from the holding LLC I exclusively controlled. Because the holding company was a legally distinct, registered entity, and because I was the sole managing trustee with absolute executive authority, Mason's unauthorized wire transfers to Gabriella Visionary Consulting, LLC, constituted severe corporate fraud and direct theft. I explained to my partners that I was legally obligated to report the missing capital immediately, lest the IRS audit the accounts and view the missing tax reserve as my own personal criminal liability. I made a deliberate choice not to press criminal charges against my father. I simply couldn't bring myself to put an aging, utterly broken man in federal prison. But I did initiate immediate, aggressive asset reclamation proceedings against my sister to recover the stolen funds. The legal notices hit Gabriella like a runaway freight train. Without Mason's stolen funds silently propping up her bank accounts, her entire fabricated lifestyle collapsed within a matter of weeks. The luxury apartment she leased downtown was actually incredibly past due on rent, a fact her landlord quickly remedied with a formal eviction notice. Her high-limit designer credit cards, which she had been paying the bare minimum balances on using the wire transfers, were instantly frozen by the banks the moment the LLC payments abruptly stopped. She attempted to fight the reclamation in court, hiring a flashy, aggressive attorney she promised to pay on contingency. But when the attorney reviewed my ironclad corporate master charter and the absolute, irrefutable paper trail proving her business had zero legitimate revenue, he dropped her as a client immediately, warning her that fighting it would only result in her own imprisonment for receiving stolen funds. She was forcefully compelled to settle out of court, signing over whatever remaining tangible assets she possessed: a heavily depreciating luxury SUV, a closet full of authentic designer handbags, and expensive jewelry, which I promptly liquidated at auction to successfully replenish the holding company's tax reserve. The last I heard from Margaret through the family grapevine, she was living in a small, dreary two-bedroom rented condo on the industrial outskirts of the city. The sprawling family estate had been surrendered to the bank, the remaining equity barely covering the exorbitant closing costs and the final, lingering debts Mason had hidden. Margaret, who hadn't worked a day in 30 years, had been forced to take a minimum wage job as a receptionist at a local dental clinic just to keep the lights on. She never called to apologize to me. She still fiercely blamed me for destroying the family, a false narrative she clung to with desperate vanity to avoid facing her own colossal failure as a mother. She and Gabriella lived together now, trapped in that miserable, suffocating apartment, feeding off each other's endless bitterness. Gabriella was working a retail job at a local mall, forced to fold the very designer clothes she used to pretend she could effortlessly afford. Her visionary consultancy, now nothing more than a humiliating footnote in the public record. Mason, however, chose a very different path. When the dust finally settled and the massive house was surrendered, he didn't follow Margaret to the miserable condo. He filed for divorce. The immense stress of the lies had finally broken their toxic marriage, and he realized he could no longer live in the enabling, delusional environment they had jointly created. 6 months after that fateful Thanksgiving dinner, I sat in a quiet, sunlit coffee shop near my office building. The brass bell above the door chimed, and Mason walked in. He looked significantly older, deeply tired, wearing a simple, inexpensive button-down shirt instead of his usual tailored, imported suits. But as he walked toward my table, he also looked incredibly light, as if a massive physical weight had finally been lifted from his shoulders. He sat down across from me, ordering a simple black coffee. We sat in silence for a long time, the ambient noise of the cafe filling the space between us. "I got a job," he finally said, his voice quiet but incredibly steady. "I'm a floor manager at a regional logistics warehouse out in the suburbs. It's not glamorous work. The pay is, well, it's what a man with my actual skill set deserves, but it's honest. For the first time in a long time, it's honest work." I took a slow sip of my green tea, looking at the man who had caused me so much profound grief and exhaustion. "I'm genuinely glad to hear that, Dad." He looked down at his rough hands, his thumbs slowly tracing the edge of his ceramic coffee cup. Riley, I don't expect you to ever fully forgive me. I stole from you. I lied to you. I let your mother treat you like a second-class citizen while you were literally sacrificing your own life to save ours. I was weak. I was terrified of losing the image I had built for myself, and I sacrificed my best daughter to keep it alive. He looked up, genuine tears shining brightly in his tired eyes. You were the strongest person in that house. You always were. And I am so incredibly sorry that it took me losing absolutely everything to finally see you for who you are. I listened to his words, quietly waiting for the familiar, burning anger to rise in my chest, but it never came. The anger had burned itself out the moment I laid that manila folder on the dining room table. All that was left in its place was a quiet, profound sense of peace. I forgive you, Dad, I said softly, and to my own surprise, I meant it. But the financial boundaries remain permanent. I will never manage your accounts again. I will not bail you out if you overdraw your checking account. Our relationship moving forward is strictly as a father and daughter, nothing more. Mason nodded vigorously, a single tear slipping down his weathered cheek. I wouldn't ask you for a single dime, Riley. Never again. I just want the chance to know my daughter. We spent the next hour just talking. Not about crushing debt, or complex corporate structures, or Gabriella's latest catastrophic disaster, but about books we were reading, about the changing weather, about life. It was the very first normal, honest conversation I had had with my father in over a decade.